acknowledge everyone in the room. I wanted to also acknowledge our director who's here, Penny Wangari Jones, our amazing team. And even though I'm presenting the report, this was a collective effort and it was written by our director, Penny, Philippa Metcalf, who's here, Karis Coleman, and Tony Lee, and myself. And it was very much a community effort. And I just wanted to acknowledge that before I start. So I'm a trustee at the Racial Justice Network, but I'm also part of Yorkshire Resist. And I'm here to talk a bit about the campaign itself, the technology, and how it's connected to what's happening right now with the police and crime bill and our report. So I'm just going to share a very brief presentation, just so I know some people need a visual aid to process the information as well. But of course, if you have any questions at any point, just put them in the chat and I'm happy to go over any points as well. So really briefly, I wanted to talk about, what is this technology? So as you can see here, this is the Biometric Gateway Service. So it basically consists of an app, and this app links to databases, which is the Ident one, which is the database, criminal database that's used by police forces, and the second one, which is the Immigration and Asylum Biometric System database. So this biometric gateway basically consists of this app that is in police officers' phone. And you can see there, this technology also has this little apparatus where you can put your fingerprint. So basically they fingerprint you and then they can either look in one database or both of them at the same time. So very briefly, these are the powers for which, the logic behind of why they can use this technology on the street, on the spot. And basically is if a police officer suspects that you've committed a crime or they suspect your identity. But also they can use it with the Mental Health Capacity Act. And for example, if you were to be unconscious, if you've had an accident, and the justification is that they can fingerprint you just to identify who you are. And obviously, this can have very serious ramifications for a lot of people, that particularly migrants. So I'm just gonna show you. This is how the app looks on the phone. So as you can see, the police can either check the immigration database or the police database. And I'm going to talk a bit further down about this, but even though it's been rolled out nationally, there's a lot of inconsistency as to how police forces in different places use this technology. So whether it's for, Sussex police automatically have police officers run the two databases. Other police forces don't necessarily have that approach, so they can choose whether to run a police check only or an immigration check only, or both. And on the right side, on my screen, but maybe yours on the other side, you can see that they can also check the identity of the person that they're fingerprinting. And this has been really important to us because, as you're going to see in our report and our freedom of information, you can see that Black and Brown communities and traveler communities, for example, are disproportionately being targeted with this technology. So very quickly, how does this process work? How does this technology actually function? So let's say there's 4 people in a car and the driver has run a red light. Our question is, who's fingerprinted? The person driving the car or the 4 people in the car that were with the person that ran the red light? So the police officer suspects that a crime has been committed in the car and they fingerprint you. So they scan you and then they search both the immigration database and the police database. Now, if you are a migrant like myself, your fingerprints, your biometric data will be on those databases. Anyone on a visa, on any type of visa with indefinite leave to remain, someone that's going through the asylum process, refugee, or people that are undocumented, we all have our fingerprints in this database. So there will be a red flag because it is immediately there. However, the police officer who's scanning on the spot on the street doesn't know why there's been a red flag. So here's where there's the decision to call the home office. And this obviously can lead to people being detained depending on their circumstances. So this technology was first implemented as a pilot here in West Yorkshire in 2018. And this is when Stop the Scan campaign started with Yorkshire Resist and the Racial Justice Network after seeing a very small note in the local newspaper that this technology was being rolled out. So this is where the campaign started, and we really wanted to know who they had consulted, if the communities had been consulted, if an equality impact assessment had been done as to how this would affect communities that are already over policed. So whether that's Black communities, Black and Brown communities, migrant communities, traveler communities, sex workers, people from lower income backgrounds. Despite this, and despite us as Racial Justice Network, but also Yorkshire Resist, really trying to stop the use of this technology until there was a full assessment on how it would impact our communities, this was rolled out nationally in 2019. And just as a note, we are preparing a second report based on Freedom of Information Acts that we've done nationally with police forces. So just keep an eye on that. But as I said, there's wide inconsistencies as to how this technology is used. So whether police forces scan and then ask to search both databases or just one. Now, the software where the biometric gateway is used, which is called Pronto, and it's in the mobiles, the phones, has now since last year been updated with COVID-19 penalty functions. So we are really concerned that we already know from data, for example, from Liberty from last year, that Black and Brown communities are already being fined more with COVID-19 fines than any other group. What we are unsure of is if they are also using, in conjunction, the biometric gateway service with the COVID-19 penalty functions. So again, this just shows how this is all interconnected. So with the new police and crime bill, we're worried that if, we already know that our communities are being over policed, and if we go to the street to protest, as is our right, then how will this technology be used on protesters, for example? So this is just a brief recap of, our campaign and why we wanted to do this report. We wanted to really, understand if there was a public awareness, despite the fact that at least here in West Yorkshire, this technology has been used since 2018. We had a sense from the communities that we support that not a lot of people knew that this technology was being implemented here in West Yorkshire, but also now nationally as well. So again, we really wanted to understand, A, if people knew about this, and B, how people felt, how this technology would impact our communities and the larger communities wide. So hence we did our report. So we launched the report in January, but we did an online survey from October to November. It was an online survey, and 115 people responded. And although we did have a widespread response from all over parts, so we had people from Scotland and Wales and England, you know, very kindly responding to our survey. As you can see here, at least half of the people that responded were from West Yorkshire. And I wanted to really sort of highlight this because the data that we got showed that the vast majority did not know that this technology existed and that it had been implemented in West Yorkshire, but also nationally as well. Out of the 115 people that responded, only one person had heard that this technology existed and was being used via the police. So again, this just shows how disproportionate, acts, how disproportionate people or the lack of information people are accessing. So you can see here again, these are the results from our report, and I just want to highlight some key numbers. So 93% of the people that responded did not support the biometric gateway service. So basically, they don't support the use of this technology. Most of all, 96%, the vast majority, think that this type of technology just embeds racial profiling. And another key element as well is that 89% felt that the police should not have access to immigration database. But above all, of the people that answered our survey, 88% who were migrants and identified as migrants said that they did not feel safe going to the police because of the existence of this technology. And this is really, really important because, the Racial Justice Network has also published a hate crime report in November. It's available on our website. And in that report, we show that, you know, people are not reporting being victims of hate crimes, because they feel unsafe to do so, especially if they're from a precarious immigration status, but also of how they would feel vulnerable with the police. So this just puts people who are victims of or survivors of domestic abuse in a really dangerous position, in people that are in exploitative work conditions, but just in general, just migrants do not feel safe going to the police. And a big part of it is obviously hostile environment policies, and this is just an extension of that. So as I said, a lot of people weren't aware of this technology, but of the people who were aware, almost half of them were aware because of an activist group like RGN really mobilizing, being very vocal that this technology exists in the first place. I wanted to really highlight these numbers as well. As part of our report and our campaign, we did a Freedom of Information Act on how this technology was used in the pilot. So as you can see, and we don't use this term, but this is the term that was used in the official data that we received. So Black and ethnic minority groups were 3 times more likely to be stopped and have their fingerprints scanned than white, British, and Irish people here in West Yorkshire. So you can see, for example, Black people particularly were 7 times out of 10,000 people more likely than white people, who were only 2 times more likely to be scanned. So again, we can just see it's not really, even though the technology is new, they just reinforce racist and institutional practices that are happening here in the UK within the police forces. So just to sort of conclude my bit, you can sort of see that out of the 115 people that responded to our survey, we saw 4 major themes. Overall, people saw this technology as an extension of stop and search. B, people thought that it was an infringement on their civil liberties and privacy, especially given, not only the Windrush generation horror that has happened and that continues to happen, but a few weeks ago, for example, we saw how the Home Office, with an algorithm problem, deleted thousands and thousands of data. So again, how can we, trust an institution that we know already treats or disproportionately impacts in a negative way Black and brown communities, but also that the data that they're using isn't 100% secure. We know, for example, that the algorithm that the Home Office uses to design and designate visas is racist, and they've lost that appeal as well. So again, it just shows how the technology is new, but the results are just, the same, and they just continue to highlight and reproduce racist and xenophobic structures as well. The third one is the scope of police powers and the fear of reporting to the police. And again, this just highlights, especially not only people from that are racially minoritized, but especially migrants and people from lower income backgrounds, traveler communities, sex workers, are even less likely to go and seek help from the police because of this technology as well, and the repercussions that that might have. And finally, it just continues to criminalize migrants for being migrants. You know, um, there's nothing more to say about that. So our recommendation that have come from the report is, first of all the mobile fingerprint devices should be removed from the police. Like, the police should not be using these, especially if we know that they're disproportionately impacting racially minoritized communities. Second of all, there should be no direct link between the immigration database and queries to command and control, especially as I've said previously, that there are flaws in the data and how the data is being used. Third, and most importantly, we want a firewall to be installed between, not only victims or witnesses to crime, but everyone who is a migrant needs to have that right, that there's a firewall between the police and immigration databases. Currently, there's the domestic abuse bill that's being going into second reading in the House of Lords next week. And in it, there's Amendment 67, which asks that there is a firewall between the police and immigration control to protect survivors of domestic abuse. So again, within our recommendations, we're asking that that expands to everyone, that everyone should be protected from that. The fourth recommendation is that the Gdpr Act, so that's basically, everyone has the right for data protection for our privacy, but migrants like us, we don't have those rights because there is this exemption that says that it should be removed if it helps the maintenance of effective immigration control. So we are asking that that is also removed. Finally, well, not finally, but the penultimate and one of the most important for us is to fund community advocates and grassroots organizations who are already supporting racially minoritized communities and migrant communities, and are stepping up when institutions and government should. So more funding for that, and making funding more accessible as well. And finally, to end hostile environment, we need to have a radical thinking. We cannot just paste something on a cut. We need to heal it completely. And in order to do that, we need to end hostile environment, because if we know that it disproportionately impacts Black and brown migrant communities, we need to really think ahead and in long term what that would entail, and that would be to end hostile environment. So I'll leave it there. But please support our campaign and get in touch if you would like to get involved, and yeah, just amplify our campaign wherever you can.
In Bradford, for example, we're a district of 540,000 residents, nearly 160 languages is spoken, and over a third of the population in Bradford would be classified as Black and minority ethnic. Now, I will start by saying that I absolutely agree with every single recommendation around these biometric fingerprint scanners in the report. Now, what I would say to people is, when you're looking at these biometric devices, we shouldn't see them in isolation, but what we should do is view them as a significant cog in the government's wider hostile environment policy machine, and something that furthers racial profiling and harassment of people of colour. Now, I'll point to one of the stats that Lara pointed out, because I think it's so relevant, is that 96% of people involved and mentioned in this report believe that these scanners embed racial profiling, and with a further 79% of people saying they would not feel safe in going to the police to ask for help. And that's massively significant, and I think is a sign of the endemic racism that exists within the police force. And whilst I will use a few more stats throughout this presentation, I would ask kindly for people to think about the people behind those stats, because these are real lives. These are people's lives who are being destroyed by this institutional racism that exists. And it'd be remiss of me not to mention the recently published Sewell report, which claimed that apparently the UK is a beacon of racial equality, and that institutional racism is still is not an issue within this country. Well, I think we all know that's completely rubbish based on the stats that Lara has just presented. And I'd like to point to a quote from the Lammy Review in 2017, in which it says that BAME people within the criminal justice system within this country still face bias, including overt discrimination in parts of the justice system. So that completely flies in the face of the Sewell report, and which should be mentioned that there was 35 separate recommendations relating to racial disparities and discrimination in the criminal justice system in the Lammy Review, which clearly goes against everything that was wrote in the Sewell report. And if we look at some really important stats around the police and criminal justice system as it exists now, this is the reason why these scanners and the current proposals in the Police and Crime Bill are even more worrying and dangerous. So we know, and the facts tell us, that BAME people die disproportionately as a result of force or restraint by the police within the criminal justice system. And I think that proves that there is institutional racism is a contributing factor to the lives of BAME people in the criminal justice system. And what I also found interesting in some of the further research I did, that in the last 5 years, only 153 out of 5,000 complaints of alleged racism against the police were upheld. I'll say that again, 153 out of 5,000. So that equates to nearly 97% of those reports. And I will name somebody who's been impacted by institutional racism in the last year. A young 12-year-old girl, a young 12-year-old refugee schoolgirl by the name of Shukra Abdi, who drowned. And we know that her family are filing a case of institutional racism against the police, because what happened in that case, not every single person who was present when Shukra died were interviewed, proving that the police didn't carry out an effective investigation into her death. And I could then go on, but I won't, in terms of the inequalities and disparities that exist for BAME people in the health sector, in terms of wealth inequalities and in terms of education. But I will link what I've just said to why the Police and Crime Bill is so worrying and so dangerous. But I'd rightfully call it the Police Crackdown Bill, which is exactly what it is. What does the bill propose to do? Well, a number of key things. Firstly, it talks about restricting the right to protest. It also, if brought in, would expand stop and search powers, which we already know disproportionately affect people of colour. It also attacks Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities. And if we saw anything in terms of the police sort of brutality at the Bristol protest, it is that violence was caused as a result of police interventions and also injury to protesters. And this is even before the bill is implemented and brought in. So what we need to say very clearly is that the right to protest should not ever be criminalised, which it would be if this bill is introduced. And actually, what this bill does is like, because people have asked the question, well, who brought this bill in? Who did that? Why is it being brought in? Don't let's make any mistake here. This has been part of a calculated and a systematic attempt to sort of further control and sort of show racist tendencies and behaviours towards people of colour. You know, it has used all the apparatus of the establishment, including the police, the media, and a whole variety of government departments, yeah? And what's happened in the past week or so, the bill has been delayed. And why has the bill been delayed? That's because of public pressure from organisations like the Racial Justice Network and good people and advocates and campaigners like yourself. And I'll sort of finish by saying that this police bill is, and as well as these fingerprint technology devices, are unquestionably dangerous. And I use that word purposely. They are dangerous. It is authoritarian. And this bill is supported by many right-wing think tanks and billionaire press owners. This is ultimately about controlling people of colour, about people who don't have as much power. But do you know what, people? We collectively do have power. So there are a number of things you can do to completely kill this bill, because that's what needs to happen. One, you can contact your MP, whatever political sort of colour they are, contact them, put pressure on them, let them know that you do not want this to go through Parliament. Sort of focus and join and support the work of the Racial Justice Network and Yorkshire Resists and other amazing organisations like this, and start to connect with others if you've not already done so. Listen to people who are affected by these devices and by this report, and get organised, get people on Zooms and what have you, and start to get more organised. So when it comes to this bill being brought back to Parliament, there will be an unquestionable sort of organisation against this bill, because actually this is quite possibly, I would say, one of the most authoritarian and dangerous pieces of legislation that has ever existed and been brought forward in my lifetime. So get together, people, get organised, and let's absolutely kill this bill, because anybody who supports this bill, and I say this as an elected politician very loudly and proudly, anybody who attempts to support this legislation are people who are supporting the racial profiling of our people. They are people who are supporting the continuation of inequality, and they are people who are supporting the continuation of the wide disparities and injustice that exist for people of colour in our society. So I will leave it there, and thank you for giving me this opportunity.
No, thank you very much, Richard. Thank you very much for really highlighting the human perspective and the people that's really affecting, especially in, you know, highlighting the case of Shukri Abdi, and also the violence caused by police intervention and the impact it does have at that very human level. So thank you very much, Richard. I would now like to invite Dr. Patrick Williams to also speak and share his perspective. So Patrick, if you can turn your camera on and mute your mic, that'd be brilliant.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. Firstly, what I'd like to do is thank the Racial Justice Network for the invitation to speak about this important report. I think the way in which you've managed to canvass the views of those who are perennially subjected to policing is really valuable. And what this also has done is it reveals the increasingly complex and different ways in which the police are currently going about their business. So your research quite fittingly also echoes many of the things that I've found in some of the work that I've been involved with in terms of research, and particularly in relation to the increasing use of technology within policing. So thank you for the invitation. Just by way of introduction, my name is Patrick Williams, and I work as a senior lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University. And over the past 2 or 3 years, I've been involved in a range of different projects which have sought to explore the encroachment of technology into policing. I've been fortunate to work with a range of individuals who I may refer to as techies when they're in the room, but individuals who have engaged in monitoring surveillance and the encroachment of surveillance practices into policing. And I guess it's from that piece that I would like to just make a short contribution today. I also recognise the implications of the bill, and this part of me thinks that would be valuable to have a conversation with everyone within this space in terms of the implications of that bill and how this may play out in the future. I guess also for me as well, and the second thing I just wanted to flag up by way of introduction was the value of the focus on the fingerprint scanners themselves. And what we have to recognise is that the fingerprint scanner is being presented as a technological solution to a perceived problem, okay? A perceived problem within the society and the wider society. And for me, there's something about having to disrupt even that argument from the outset. And I can see that Laura attempted to do that, has done that from the outset. But that becomes critical within this point, because for me, the perceived problem isn't notions of immigration. The perceived problem isn't notions of criminality or crime. The perceived problem is the presence of black and brown bodies within what are perceived to be white spaces. And it's within that context that black and brown bodies and individuals and groups and communities have always been viewed with a suspicion. And through that suspicion, therefore, we become the objects to be police. We become the foci for police attention. So it's within that context that Eric Kind and myself, who co-authored the report, wrote the report, Data-Driven Policing, the Hardwiring of Discriminatory Policing Practices across Europe. And I guess it's within that sense that I want to try and disrupt this notion that the tech itself is a seemingly silver bullet to resolve social and criminal problems. It's not. And again, for someone who teaches criminology, for me, it's really crucial for us to think about, well, what does the encroachment of technology signal? What is this seduction of technology that everybody seems to be clamoring around? And we're talking about policing today, but increasingly we'll see it in relation to responses to the pandemic and passports, etc. The clamour towards tech as a way of trying to resolve what are perceived to be social problems. And I guess it's with this in mind that I reflected on some of the work of Liz Ficchetti from the Institute of Race Relations. And I'm reading a quote from her here. But what she says is the figure of the foreign criminal has emerged in populist folklore as another archetypal cultural bogeyman, most often dark-skinned and always racialized. He is predatory and hypersexualized, or particularly if she's Roma, a destitute scrounger. The essentialized and culturally determined deviant nature of the foreign criminal is used to justify the deportation drive against migrants and asylum seekers, the foreign poor, and other troublesome elements. Now, I think it's within this context, therefore, and with reference to the above quote, that we can begin to observe the significant implications of the tech. Because in the work that I was involved with, what we can see is that technological solutions are simplistically presented as neutral, seemingly scientific and objective. The technology is devoid of bias and discrimination. And that's the argument that we're often presented with. In essence, some individuals argue that by using tech, we can undermine disproportionate and discriminatory policing. I want to say categorically that is a nonsense, and that the tech is not neutral. What we can recognise is that minoritized communities and black and brown people have always been subjected to over-policing within the UK and across Europe, always been subjected to stop and search and racial profiling. And as the previous speaker mentioned, we can look at national data which speaks to the overrepresentation and differential treatment of minoritized groups and communities. So for me, to use tech within this context can only serve to increase levels of disproportionality in policing. Discriminatory data into the tech will result in discriminatory practice out of the tech. So related to this, to be stopped and searched and subject to policing and over-policing is not a feature of our behaviours or criminal behaviours, but it's triggered by police suspicion. So we're consistently, again, across Europe and England and Wales, black and brown people have always been viewed with this suspicion. We're always racialized as criminal and therefore policed on that basis. So what I also want to point towards is how increasingly, therefore, this suspicion is almost being shifted towards this notion of riskiness, a sense that we pose a criminal threat to the white public, which in turn legitimizes the over-policing of our communities. And therefore, to be stopped and searched isn't random, and I've said this on numerous occasions, to be stopped and searched isn't random or an inconvenient event. For me, it's a deliberate, politically sanctioned practice, which traumatizes those individuals who encounter the police, but also serves to reaffirm a sense of who belongs and who does not belong. It is not a strategy to reduce levels of crime or criminality, however defined, but to regulate those who are constructed as outsiders, the criminal other. I guess for me, therefore, many organizations who want to attempt to resist the tech, we tend to want to approach this on human rights grounds or privacy, on grounds of ethics. Now, I'm not sure whether that's the right tech, and it talks again to the point that Laura just made. The simple reality is that those individuals who are perceived as outsiders or as criminal or as immigrants or as not belonging, okay, are exempt from human rights legislation. In essence, it's not there to protect. And when we look at a myriad of the cases, for example, deaths in police custody or deaths at the hands of the police, we can increasingly see how black and brown bodies are treated differentially to their white counterparts. So I guess, and maybe something that we can pick up later on, therefore, is how do we reframe the notion of the problem away from the notion of human rights towards one of anti-racism and a fight against racism and discrimination. Because in essence, what I begin to see in relation to the notion of data harms, to the encroachment of tech, is this notion of data harms. And by definition, what I mean by data harms is the adverse effects caused by the uses of data that may impair, injure, or set back a person, entity, or society's interest. So for me, and an increasing particular concern is that the gathering, collection, and retention of data, and then the fusing of these different data sources, are being fused for the purpose of prediction and risk assessment. We're attempting to predict where the crime problem exists, where the risk of crime may take place. But invariably, as I said earlier, dodgy data in means we will get dodgy results out. And invariably, this will lead to the police policing black and brown communities. The fact that an individual's details are held on a database and then is checked by the police is in and of itself hugely problematic. And I'd be really interested in listening to Kevin's take on some of this as well. However, looking elsewhere, what we can also begin to see is the profound effect of this data fusion. So if we look at the gangs database and gangs matrix in London, we're recently talking about hundreds of individuals' names being held on a database, not for their behaviours, not for their engagement in criminality, but through their associations to the geographical area where they live, or their associations to friends and families. Or the simple fact that these are black and brown groups and communities is what results in individuals being subjected and placed on these databases. It's within there that we can begin to see the serious damage of data harms, because equally those individuals who were held on those databases had a range of social goods withheld, excluded from schools, excluded from colleges, unable to get employment, told which estates they could go into and where they were to be excluded from. This is what we refer to as data harms. And what's really valuable is that the report has begun to surface some of these data harms and should also signal to us the areas in the direction of travel in terms of how we begin to build resistance system of this. Just on a final note, the proposed powers within the Police Crime and Sentencing and Courts Bill does not serve to protect black and brown communities. It doesn't serve to protect those individuals who are at risk of over-policing. What the bill seeks to do is to simply serve to justify and legitimise the encroachment and over-policing of minoritized communities. This is all hidden under the guise of responses to serious violence, through the serious violence reduction orders. In essence, these will be trained again on the very same communities who have always been over-policed. So my concern here, therefore, And again, in relation to what Laura highlighted, is that many people are unaware of the tech. They're unaware of how this may impact upon their lives. Policing is increasingly becoming a concealed practice, taking place through technology. It's this that I believe, and others have often argued, what we must resist. We have to therefore begin to disrupt this notion of the encroachment of technology into policing as a way of trying to mitigate the harms that will increasingly emerge from such approaches. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you very much for really touching on the, the importance of how, looking at data can actually perverse our rights. And whilst the device and all the different forms of technology we're seeing is being used to justify, effective policing, I love the dodgy data in, dodgy data out. And, what does this mean? How do we justify the use of this data when we can see it's being used to encroach and over police not only Black and brown communities, ethnically minoritized communities, and also marginalized communities? So I really, really want to make a key point and really put on that point there that we need to think about what this means and continue to ask ourselves these questions. So I would now like to invite our next speaker, Kevin Blow, to speak and also share his perspectives. So Kevin, if I can please ask you to unmute your mic and turn your camera on, that'd be great.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for inviting me today. My name is Kevin Blow. I'm the campaigns coordinator for the Network for Police Monitoring, NetPol. And I've also been for many years an activist for a community police monitoring group in the area where I live in East London, Newham. And I really want to start off by echoing something. One of the interesting things about listening to other people, I've been madly scribbling down notes because what I really want to do is respond to some of the stuff that they've said, but also just to talk about what we do about this situation. And what Patrick said about this fundamentally being about anti-racism is something that really resonated with me, because the work that I was involved in for many years in East London was about challenging the uses or misuses of police powers, but it was fundamentally an anti-racist project. It was about exposing the targeting of Black and minority communities. Now, I was a small part of in the background doing work on sort of organising stuff, but it was some of the experiences that came from that work are stuff that I really wanted to kind of maybe touch on in a bit. I wanted to also just very quickly talk about the police bill, because it's been raised. So, and I think rather than go into any more of the detail, I think it's important to see this as the sort of the provider of context to where we are. So, because the police bill isn't one bill, it's effectively 4 bills. It's a massive piece of proposed legislation. And the part of the reason why the government has lumped this together is obviously in the sense of wanting to paint a picture, if you like, of the threats that are perceived to be out there, primarily to the police. And it's no accident that the first part of the bill is about protecting the police. The second part of the bill is about the prevention, investigation and prosecution of crime. The third part is the bit that's got the most attention, I guess, which is the stuff around protest and public order. And the fourth part is another attack on Gypsy, Roma and Traveller communities, which has been actually a piece of proposed legislation that's been knocking around for a year in terms of shutting down unauthorised encampments. But overall, the bill as an entirety is about, how do I explain? It's about aiming to kind of strengthen the use of surveillance, the strength of criminalisation techniques at the communities that we live in working class, Black, multicultural, international communities in this country, through a variety of strands. Certainly, it's unquestionable that the different strands of the bill have been lobbied for really intensely by senior levels of the police. That NetPol has done a lot of work recently in trying to emphasise how that is particularly true of the provisions around protest, but it's true of the entire bill. And of course, the same applies to every single piece of new technology that's ever been introduced, whether it's body cams, whether it's mobile fingerprint technology, whatever it might be. This is about technology being used to make that process of criminalization more efficient. And that's why Patrick's right. It's not just about privacy. It's not just about human rights. This is a tool for the process of harassment, of criminalization, and in particular of targeting racialized communities. It is absolutely tied to, quite obviously, the ongoing and existing misuse of stop and search powers. And like stop and search powers, as we're already beginning to see from some of the initial statistics that have come out about its use, it is clearly being disproportionately targeted against certain people within our communities. One of the things that I think is important to remember in terms of being able to push back against this is that we're in this strange kind of situation where policing in Britain feels like it has a champion in the government, and that things like the disproportionate use of police powers, or particularly a stop and search, which for years the police have attempted to kind of describe away. You know, we're working on this is the constant refrain. But now they're just saying, well, you know, of course the power is disproportionate, and that's inevitable because of high rates of crime in certain communities. It's absolute. We not only do we accept that it's disproportionate, we welcome that. It's a reflection of the commitment to dealing crime within Black and working class communities, which is frankly an insulting approach to the problems that, because obviously the balance for this, of course, is that people who are victims of crime themselves are also have consistently complained about being treated as second-class citizens by the police when they try to report crime. So let me just kind of begin to kind of flesh out some initial thoughts around how do we make people know about their rights and about the implications of new technology like mobile fingerprinting. I think it's important to remember, to looking at the way that other police powers are implemented, it's important to remember that actually quite often what happens is that the police will rely upon people's ignorance. And that's true across the board when it comes to concerns about making sure that we educate people about their rights. So nearly 8 years ago, there was an initial attempt to introduce fingerprint technology in London. And we used to monitor a number of the kind of online discussion groups for police officers, and they would talk about this, and they would say, you know, we didn't tell people that they had about the use of this technology. We invited them to use it, and of course most people don't know that they're not obliged to. In an interaction with the police, they want to get the hell out of that circumstance as quickly as possible, and therefore they comply. The other sort of balancing consideration, I guess, is that fingerprint technology is one aspect of a variety of different tools that police officers will have in order to be able to kind of pull information out of people. And certainly we've seen examples of the police relying on Section 50 of the Police Reform Act, which is particularly intended to be used for antisocial behaviour, but which is that one power, which is the exception of you needing to provide your personal details or otherwise facing arrest. And so that's being used, that is the potential for that to be used as the threat that forces people into complying with the use of having their fingerprints taken on the streets is obviously there. Now, clearly, as an organisation that advocates against the misuse of police powers, we will always argue that these kind of uses should be resisted and opposed. And for that reason, we would urge people, if they're not reasonably suspected of a criminal offence, to refuse to comply with mobile fingerprinting unless there's an absolutely good reason why they shouldn't do so. But I think in most cases, as we've seen with stop and search powers are used in a way that targets 80 to 90% of people who, you know, there's no reasonable grounds, not really, for searching them. And therefore, if you're in that category, you should be pushing back against that. But how do we let people know this? One of the questions I think it's always useful to reflect upon is, how do people find out about their rights, and how do they get the confidence to be able to stand up for them? How do they get to push back against a circumstance where, you know, a figure of authority with enormous power is in a position to be able to try and, you know, quite often manipulate you into getting information out that they want to get from you? Now, people find out about what their rights are from a variety of different places. Sometimes it's from the internet, and therefore the importance is that there's information out there that's accurate. A lot of people get to know what their rights are from people that they trust. So a lot of the work that we did when I was doing work on a local community level around rights, and in general, but in particular around stop and search, was doing training for youth workers, so that youth workers could then cascade that information down to the young people that they were working. Because frankly, if I stood up in front of a group of teenagers as a white 50-something, it doesn't have the same power as somebody who young people work with day in, day out. And so therefore, that idea of providing some training to those people who can then make sure that the people who need the information the most is something that's incredibly important. But the third thing is about, people hear about this stuff because they hear stories. So people hear about the experiences of other people who challenge the kind of acceptance of the use of police powers, including the uses of police technology, and do so publicly. So you hear that somebody refused to comply with a stop and search, and that stop and search was unlawful, and that they've challenged it, and that they've perhaps brought a complaint, or they've sued the police, or whatever it is. And that story makes people think, I can do the same thing. But that doesn't unfortunately come out of nowhere. So in the work that I do every single day, I get requests from people saying, this has happened to me, where can I go for help? And there is a real need. There's a need for people to be able to offer help in the local communities where they are, if they feel that they've been misled by the use of police powers, or if they've been unfairly targeted, in particular, if they've been unfairly targeted because of the colour of their skin, or the in some cases because of their religious beliefs. And there's a whole separate debate, which I'm not going to go into now, about the particular targeting of Muslim communities. There is a need to help people to make complaints. The complaint system is slow, it's frustrating, and a lot of people, if they ever enter into it, never want to go down that route again. There is a need to provide the kind of information and training that I've already hinted upon. There is a need for a place for people to be able to go if they need help, and for other people to refer them to if they, are kind of stuck in a situation where they don't know what to do next. The difficulty we have is, of course, that access to legal aid has been severely restricted. Agencies like law centres are overwhelmed with cases, quite often overwhelmed with other problems in society, like the absolute unfairness of the benefit system, for instance. And so it is difficult, and that's why quite often, I spend a fair amount of my time answering emails from people just saying, this is what you need to do. But it's not the kind of in-depth support that I would like us to be able to do, because we just don't have the resources. So this brings me back to a thing that I've argued again and again over the last 6 or 7 years, which is we need local groups on the ground taking up this work. If we're going to challenge the rollout of mobile fingerprint technology It needs to be in the context of an anti-racist rejection of the misuse, broader misuse of police powers, and it needs to be gathering the data, supporting people who are facing those experiences. It needs to be publicly challenging, and it needs to be taking those stories and turning that into campaigns, because that has been the way that the kind of oppressive nature of policing in the past has been resisted, and it's been effective. But it's going to come from people on the ground, and so whatever happens next with the rollout of this technology, I would still argue that the most effective way that we can challenge this is to be able to start organising in our local communities. That is how we're going to make sure that we push back against the misuse of oppressive, racist police powers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for that contribution and really talking about the things that we could do. And I think it's really important, the last call you put out there, for us to start at a community level and start collectively. So thank you so much for sharing your perspective with us. So I would now like to invite any sort of questions that people may have that have attended or who are watching the event right now, to please let us if you have any questions for any of the speakers or just any general questions. But again, thank you to all the speakers, because I think we've really covered a range of things in terms of looking at the report and connecting the report a lot wider to what's happening. And even with this new bill that is, as Kevin highlightly pointed out, it's just not one bill, but it's 4 bills together. I think it is really important that we continue to sort of speak to what we can do and speak to what we are doing, especially within our different organizations. Okay. So I think a few questions have come up. I will take some time just to have a read of the questions, and then I'll put them to the speakers. So I think in this moment, I'd like to invite all the speakers actually to turn their cameras on. So then, you know, we can just do a jumping and have a discussion at this point. Okay, so there's a question that come to the speakers that said, have you seen or do you see how the stop and scan technology and gang matrix could be used in a school context under the guise of safeguarding by school-based police officers, of which we know there are many more proposed around the UK, or by other schools-based means? Schools ABC did some amazing work in organising to stop the DFE sharing nationally and place of birth data with the Home Office for immigration and control purposes, but could this data sharing resurface through stop and scan and matrix in schools? So I'll leave that question there. Is there anyone that'd like to answer that question?
I can give it a go. I mean, it's a very short answer though, which is that, as I said, you give the police the technology, they're going to use it. And the issue around the gangs matrix was an entirely false set of assumptions about who may well be at risk, that meant that you could end up on the gangs matrix because a member of your family had been accused of being a member of a gang, one of your friends was a member of a gang, you lived in a block where it was deemed to be a gang activity area. And in this circumstances, it's not so much about what happens when you are fingerprinted, mobile fingerprinted, it's how often that might happen. So in the same way that the gangs matrix essentially meant that you were a constant target for being stopped and searched. And actually the new bill makes that worse, because obviously if you've been any young person who's been convicted of carrying a knife pretty much faces a lifetime of uninterrupted stop and search on the basis, without the need for any grounds, on the basis of a potential serious violent crime disorder. I can definitely foresee circumstances where the police will just spot you and think, oh, he's a wrong 'un. I know who he is, but doesn't make a difference. I'll just go and make his life hell by going over there, going out and doing a stop and search, and then demanding to have his fingerprints as a tool for being able to just remind people, particularly young people, that the police are a presence in their community. this is an absolute gift.
Can I just add to that and echo what Kevin's speaking to? I think you're absolutely spot on there, Kevin, in terms of the potentiality for manipulation and exploitation of the tech there. And also follows on from some work I did alongside a range of organisations. I think it was on behalf of Stopwatch, the Biometric report. And what we found within that piece of work were clear instances of where that gang label almost followed young people around. So we knew of young people, and again, this notion of risk and riskiness, because individuals were flagged as a gang risk. And remember the definitions that people who are on the matrix were deemed to have been gang members, however defined, gang associated or at risk of violence, could also have you registered on the gang's database. So you could be on there and not be a gang member, which is bizarre in and of itself. But within that context there, the risk notion therefore meant that young people were being excluded from schools because they were deemed to have been a risk to other children within the school in case something happened within the school environment. We know this also happened in people's homes. So there are instances of social services intervening in families because children were thought to be at risk of gang involvement or gang associated. And I have no trouble with the gang label anyway, and I've spent lots of time trying to disrupt this notion. But the really important work and the linkages, I think, that I detected in the question, and there's some really valuable work coming out of the Northern Police Monitoring Project and also Kids of Colour, who are beginning to speak to the use of schools-based police officers. And what we're finding within what they found in their work isn't that the police are there to try and minimise the risk of violence within the school setting, but almost in and of itself becomes an intelligence gathering mechanism. So the police can gather intelligence on young people and children within the school in terms of what's taking place. And again, it's that data that can be fed into other data systems, which can then compile lists and reams of individuals and their personal details, and then begin to assume who is at risk and who is not risky. For me there, and that's where the tension lies. It's how that experience of being policed and surveilled and having the data captured onto different data sets is where we see the serious potential for data harms taking place. And that's what I think we need to guard against in that piece. And that's why there should be clear resistance around police officers in schools. So it's obvious, for me, it's clear that the police will utilise a school as a fertile space within which they can gather intelligence. And just finally, as an anecdote, one lad who I did interview, who was matrixed, and again, to echo what Kevin just said, literally policed with impunity, 100 times, 200 times, 300 times, subject to stop and search. An individual who spoke about being strip searched 10 times. In essence, there's this impunity in terms of how these groups and these individuals are treated and can be treated because of this gang label. But then what I found remarkable was that an individual being subject to high levels of stop and search in and of itself became a reason for stopping and searching that individual because they'd had previous contact with the police. And therein lies those tensions and those problems and those challenges. So yeah, there are serious concerns and potential for data harm being inflicted on younger people. But I also see that as a feature of gathering intelligence on children and young people within particular areas.
Can I just add that as well from like a different perspective? At RGN, we also work alongside community advocates from migrant communities. And what we've seen over the past year with COVID is that a lot of children and youth from migrant communities are falling behind at school because they simply don't have the technology to go online. And then that alerts the school, and then they get fined or they get criminalized or put in detention or whatever because they are not going to school in a way. So that's one thing. Another thing as well, now that, for example, face masks are mandatory in secondary schools, there are people who simply cannot afford that, right? So again, I just wanted to bring that different perspective that this then feeds into how schools are already policed or criminalized. It's an extension of the criminalizing state in a way. So we really need to, again, think of this as a whole and how these different ways, for example, in the school, I do remember, I mean, I remember filling out for my school's children's, you know, we have to fill out that where we were from, our passports and whatnot, and then that suddenly stopped. So we can see how mobilization from the public as a community can have a direct impact, for example, of some of the work that Patrick was talking about with Kids of Color and Northern Police, of how we can push back against having not only police, but this mindset of criminalizing almost the schools as well, and seeing them as an extension of the police. But this is just, yeah, that we need to come together as a community and support the work that's being done from the grassroots, because the more we are, it's more pressure as well.
If I can add to that as well, from a slightly different perspective, but following on from what Lara said, is we've got to look at, like, over the past sort of 10 years, a lot of schools have been academized, and what that does is poses greater risk of this stuff being able to happen more easily, because whereas when things were in public local authority control, things were more publicly accountable. But now the academised schools in the country are responsible, have 13 regional schools commissioners who are directly responsible to the Department of Education, which makes the potential of sharing data around individual schools a lot more easier. So when we're talking about community organising, I would also say where academies and other state-run schools as well are police officers, we know that, how can we support migrant communities and wider community members to become governors of schools, to be asking those questions and to ultimately resist police being present within school settings. So yeah, so that's just slightly different take.
No, thank you very much, Richard, but also thank you to all the speakers for giving your take on that question as well. One thing I would like to ask at the moment, I know we've been talking, and there's been so many things that have been shared by the speakers, so many good points to cover, and I forgot to offer a break. So would people like to have a 5-minute break at this point, and then we can come back to some of the questions? And we still have more questions. So I'd just like to put that question firstly to the speakers. And would you like to take a break at this point, and then we can resume back in maybe 5 minutes? Yeah, is that, I see Kevin with a thumbs up. Yeah, okay, no worries. Okay, so we will break at this point. So if I can ask everyone to sort of join us back here, we'll do 4 minutes to keep it nice and even at 20 past 1. That would be great. And then we can resume with the questions and the discussion and comments. So thank you very much. So thank you. So just waiting to get Patrick back with us, and then we can get started again with some of the questions that have come through. I'd like to, at this point again, say thank you everyone who's attended and who's engaged and is asking questions, and also people who are just listening and taking this in. The speakers were brilliant. You shared a lot of ideas in terms of what this device and the use of this technology means, but also what this new bill means, but also some of the actions people can take towards it. So thank you so much for facilitating our thoughts and facilitating our discussion. So I would like to, if Patrick's back with us, and I will like to then move on to the next question, but I guess I'll put to all the speakers again, and feel free to just jump in from your perspective to answer the questions. So the second question that we have here is there tech we can use to protect ourselves and each other from police surveillance and targeting?
Happy to jump in with a quick thing and say, no, not really. I mean, I think one of the things about surveillance that people need to remember is that in an information age, actually substantial proportions of what the police gather as intelligence is shared by us. You know, so if people are going to be putting large amounts of information about what they're doing on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, then they're going to need to be aware of the fact that there are sophisticated programs being used by police forces to analyze hashtags, to work out particular references to particular places, and that has been used for protest, and it's been used for a variety of other purposes, including the targeting of young people around, you know, alleged gang activities. So there isn't a simple answer to the question of what do we do to make the stop the police from conducting surveillance. The issue is that they will, and that they have the technology to be able to do so. The real question is what happens when you discover that this is happening and want to push back against it. And that's, for me, why it always comes back to the issue of having a place where people can go. It's a community organising issue rather than a privacy issue.
Thank you, Kevin. Is there anyone else that wants to jump in with that question? No, okay, no worries. We'll move on to our next question. So we've got a question that said, then thanks for the fab contributions. Was wondering about this local community resistance, but to the bigger themes and pattern. You spoke about the gang matrix and immigration data transfer. I would love to hear your thoughts on local resistance to these wider, broader issues on increased powers that include what you mentioned, but also that operate beyond our borders. So thinking of overseas operation bills and spy cop bills, etc. How do we build that organising on the ground holistically?
I don't mind giving that a bit of a go, because in my day job, as well as a counsellor, I'm actually a community organiser as well. So I follow as an organiser 5 key principles, and I think they work for me no matter whether it's projects at a local level or an international level. And I'll go through them very quickly. The first one is about telling stories. So telling the stories of the people affected by these bills, 100%. If you're going to do anything in organising, you do that, you're going to do pretty well, I'd say. The second principle is around building relationships. So who are the people you need to build the relationships with to get your point across? So who are the people in the media you need to get to? Who are the people in the local community organisations, in trade unions, whatever it might be? That concept of building relationships, second most important thing. The thing then about structuring the team, so to get to your aim, when you've got your aim in terms of what you want to achieve, who needs to be around the table? So in terms of a core team, wider teams, and sort of community-based teams. So thinking about how the teams are structured and who needs to do the work to get to where you need to. The fourth point is around how you strategize. So thinking about the tactics you use, because using a certain tactic at one point could actually damage your campaign. So thinking about what you're going to do and when is really, really important. And the sort of last point is the one we're all in this space and room perhaps, is around acting. So we've told a story, we've strategized, we've built as teams, you know, we need some action to kill the bill. So yeah, so there would be the 5 principles I would say in terms of elevating campaigns and organising.
Thank you very much, Richard. Is there anyone else that wanted to jump in to answer that question?
Yeah, can I just pick up on some of that as well? I think that was really valuable, Richard. In fact, you could have written something that I've written recently in relation to some of that. Some of the work we've been doing is about how we begin to surface the encroachment of technology in other European spaces as well. So we're at early points in thinking about some of this. But what's really interesting is how what we believe is about foregrounding some of those stories first. So I think you're absolutely right, telling those stories, but also for us, there's a question around this notion of data harms. So, and it's going to a point that I think many of the speakers have come to, there's almost an unawareness of the tech. So how do you know to what extent it's having an impact on your life when it's not even evident that this tech is in use? And there's something really interesting about how that takes place. And you can only begin to reveal that through telling those stories. So I think it's important that those stories come to the fore. Individuals may speak about children being excluded or being subject to stop and searches, or being asked in European countries for ID in certain spaces. In some European countries, there's ghetto zones where literally there's a number of variables that are being used as a way of saying anyone who lives in this geographical area will be subject to a different type of policing and also subject to different forms of punishment. So it's about surfacing where the data harms may be taking place and then beginning to respond to that. I also think you're absolutely right in terms of building collectives with individuals who have an awareness of both the tech, surveillance, policing, sociological appreciations, but that all has to surround individuals who are grounded within communities. They have to be at the forefront of these conversations. And again, I'm looking back at new in police monitoring projects as models for how we work within communities to surface those harms that are being experienced. But I think most recently, lots of people are also thinking about how we litigate. So is it possible to use legal apparatus around us as a way of surfacing what the harms are, but then also taking this to court as a way of trying to get some redress? There's conversations around legal routes to anti-discrimination and anti-racist practices. However, I'm happy to have those conversations, or indeed, I think we should be having those conversations. But in essence, surfacing those stories, having individuals who can make sense of the tech and the impact of that tech, but then also thinking about litigation strategies is one that we should be thinking about going forward. And there are also community groups within other geographical European spaces. And I think the question, and whoever asked the question is absolutely right. It's about how we forge those relationships and links with those other organisations, because there is something about the tech almost transcending borders. And how we begin to make sense of that and how we begin to disrupt that means that we have to be building links across the country, but also across the continent and more globally as well.
Yeah, I want to echo what Patrick was saying now, like the surveillance of racially minoritized people and our bodies and migrants is not something that's happening here in the UK. It's happening in the US. It's happening in my home country in Mexico towards migrants and towards you know, Black Afro-Latinos as well. So we really, when we talk about these things, when we talk about violence, when we talk about white supremacy, when we talk about you know, institutional racism, we have to think global and act local. We have to have those international solidarity connections, but also, as Patrick was saying, like always grounded on the community advocates that are on the ground, that are not personality based, but that are community based and move forward. And it's really important that we do make those international connections, because that, you know, the surveillance, the racist algorithms that are used to design, to, you know, award visas and documents, the technology, the facial recognition that's used in airports, it's not something that's happening here in the UK, it's happening all over. And the people that are, you know, at the forefront of having this technology tested on them is racially minorities communities, especially if they are poor, if they are undocumented, and if they have the intersections of, you know, a disability, their sexuality, etc. So it's really important, yeah, that we act local, but think global and connect at an international level as well.
Thank you very much, Laura. Kevin, I'll let you jump in there.
Very, very quickly. I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. The only thing I would add is that there is a tendency sometimes to think globally and then think the local stuff's a bit hard work, so we just focus on the global. And it is hard work. There's no question about that at all. It's about going and getting your hands dirty, because getting stories is not just about documenting them. Because you can get, and a lot of communities will talk about the fact that people come and ask them for their stories and then nothing changes. It's about providing something that helps people to have the tools to be able to fight back against the oppression that they're experiencing. And so, and that means you've got to be there, and you've got to be offering something like writing letters and, you know, going with somebody to make a complaint or whatever it might be. This is the nuts and bolts of what community organizing does. And the frustration, I think, sometimes is that we get caught up in the policy stuff, because in some ways it's easier to talk about the broad brush things and don't realize that we have to put as much more effort into the kind of structures and organizing and the ability to be able to just do the stuff that makes a difference to people's lives. And I think it's really important to constantly emphasize that that's not easy, because if you're going to do it, you've got to have some consistency, and you've got to be able to offer something that people think is actually going to make a difference to them. Otherwise, you know, people are let down all the time by the state. We don't need to be another group of people that let people down.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Very, very important. Go ahead, Patrick.
I guess I was just taking liberties and wanted to ask a question myself. I know it might feel a bit unusual, but I was just...
No, go ahead. No, thank you.
And Richard as well. And to be honest, there are two questions here as well. There was something around, and something I've been thinking about, is there a point at which we can begin to disrupt the technology itself? And I'm starting from the premise that the tech is often developed by young, small companies who see an opportunity to sell the seductions of the technology to the police or other law enforcement agencies. I also work in a university, and shamefully I recognise academics who are engaged in technological solutions and fixes. And I'm wondering at what point we can disrupt at that point as well. And it's a question I'm asking Kevin and Laura, just to see what your thinking is on some of this, because rather than can we use the tech as a way of resistance, is there a way in which we can begin to consistently disrupt the tech in its design and in its development? And there was also a question I wanted to ask Richard as well, going back to the teacher thing in schools. And this is something about, because what we found in terms of police in schools and the use of tech and intelligence gathering was that it wasn't the police as such, and I was quite surprised at this, it wasn't the police that wanted to get into schools. It was head teachers and boards of governors who felt there was a crime problem that needed to be resolved by trying to get police into schools. So they were therefore using resources as a way of funding police being in the schools. So again, is there a way in which we can disrupt that from a different angle by challenging head teachers and boards of governors rather than putting that pressure on the police and the mayor's office? And I don't have an answer to that. It's just something I'm thinking aloud about.
Thank you for that question, Patrick. That's a very important question. So Laura, I'll let you go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll talk strictly about the university. I'm a lecturer myself at a university. I think people would have to be willing to give up a lot of privilege, especially white colleagues. And I'm not sure they would be willing to do that. You know, a clear example is we see these rapid calls from funding bodies on COVID-19. And whereas, you know, a project that's supported by, you know, community advocates and seeing, for example, the impact that COVID-19 has had in racially minority communities or migrant communities, they'll fund, you know, something that's around like, how can we, you know, better report COVID-19, you know, crimes or, you know, people breaking the law. And instead of actually saying, hey, this is really wrong, like we are being, we as a university, need to be accountable to the larger community outside, right? Not just the people that are allowed within our physical spaces, but the community that we are, the city that we are. And we are actively then contributing to the policing of those communities, of racially minoritized communities. So first of all, I think universities and the people working in universities need to see themselves as part of that community, which is often not the case. Another thing as well is like universities are complicit in surveilling international staff and students through data, whether that's wiping the card, sending emails that they need to report, and very freely reporting them to the home office. If with COVID-19, a lot of students are unable to pay their tuition fees and whatnot. So again, it's about people willing to not only to disrupt, but to relinquish that privilege and that power that comes, because it's often like Black and brown staff, early careers, students who are disrupting, and we do it at a very large cost. Whether it's our career or being troubled as, the troublemaker, the angry person that's always bringing stuff around that. But yeah, I think it's really about disrupting those spaces. And speaking as someone that's super privileged of working at a university, as someone that has papers that have allowed me to work at the university as an international, as a migrant. It's disrupting those spaces and making people uncomfortable and making them acknowledge those privileges. That's sort of from my perspective. But Kevin, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Well, I mean, look at the way the universities have treated some of their own students over the last year since the COVID lockdown, and you realise that the question of ethics is obviously very movable. I think part of the answer, I mean, I think you're right. There is a difficulty in expecting individual academics with the universities to be able to take on what is a power structure that creates this. I mean, there is a case for arguing that the entire field of criminology is basically partially owned by the Home Office, given that a substantial proportion of the funding for a lot of criminology is about making policing more efficient. I do think that there is a role for organisations like the Racial Justice Network in being able to embarrass. And I'll give you an example. So the concept of police liaison officers at protests is something that we've done a lot of work on over the last 10 years. This is the officers that have the blue bibs. And the academic justification for that was that it meant that there were officers who were there, who were friendly, who were making sure that there was no surprises. And the academics who advocate for that stuff don't advocate that anymore, because for years we've been pushing and exposing how whatever the good intentions that you may have had in proposing this, quotes, more efficient approach to policing is about power, and policing doesn't care about your good intentions. And maybe pushing back against the companies and the academics and so on, who, I suspect don't think too hard about the potential consequences of the technology that they're producing. Just see it as being a way of being able to fight against crime, the general thing about crime, and exposing the consequences, the negative consequences that this has on substantial numbers of people. It may not stop them from developing new forms of technology, but it will make it much easier to be able to pretend. Much more difficult to pretend that somehow this technology is neutral. I think that's all we can do in a way, is that we expose the consequences and we challenge those people to explain why it is that they've not taken them into account.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you, Patrick, to raising that question, because I think it was really important. And Laura, thanks as well for sharing that perspective from inside the ivory tower. So thank you. We'll move on to our next question from one of the audience. Bear with me. There's a lot of good questions coming in. So a question from Udith is, could you share advice on holding the police accountable at delivering justice in case of racist online hate crime against people of colour. So that's to all the speakers. Could you share advice on holding the police accountable at delivering justice in cases of racist online hate crime against people of colour? Anyone like to go first? Yep, go ahead, Kevin. Thank you.
Well, I mean, as people who find themselves being the subject of online pylons, particularly by the far right, have found that some of the social media companies are pretty poor at being able to protect people that are on there who are facing this. There is legislation that applies in these cases in which the police should intervene if there is actually a hate crime. But as with all hate crimes, it is, and I mentioned this right at the beginning about the over policing that happens when people are just out on the streets, but then the under policing when people are actually victims of crime themselves. It is incredibly difficult to get the police to take this stuff seriously. I do think it's important that people make complaints. Obviously, you want to reinforce the position that if there are people that can help people to make those complaints, then they're more likely to go somewhere, because there's an awful lot of pushback from the professional standards departments of police forces against wanting to essentially wind up and make this stuff go away. And if there is a pattern of this emerging within an area, so for instance, if there's a lot of people that are being targeted by a group in a particular town or city, being able to point out the consistent failures of the police to be able to challenge this sort of hate crime is potentially something that that an organised group on the ground is in a position to do. But the reality is that the police are terrible at dealing with hate crime, full stop. So it's not really any different whether it's online or whether it's somebody putting a brick through somebody's window. It doesn't mean that the police are going to do anything about it.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. I think we, at the Racial Justice Network, we also did a report on hate crime where we really found this to be the case as well, and especially hate crime towards Black and Brown communities, ethnically minoritised communities, especially communities where people are seeking refuge and asylum. So this is really one of the things that we're, as an organisation, that we're very focused and we value working on, how people within our communities experience that hate crime and what we can do to deal with this. Is there anyone else that wanted to sort of answer that question before we move on to the next one? Okay, thank you. We'll move on to the next one. So from the YouTube, we have a question that says, how do we expose and highlight tech companies who are complicit and hardwire into these digital systems of oppression? What do we think can be done to resist these infrastructure? So again, that is, how do we expose and highlight tech companies who are complicit and hardwired into these digital systems of oppression? What do we think can be done to break and resist these infrastructures? Anyone like to take that one first? I see people smiling. Oh.
I mean, I think that's quite tricky. For example, the Pronto software, which is the software where the biometric gateway is used, is done by Motorola, for example. So, you wouldn't sort of associate that. You have your phone, and it's so I think it's really difficult because these tech companies are everywhere. Like if you think of like Facebook and whatnot, like they have investments in everything. I think at least from my point of view, it's, collectively as public putting a pressure on. So for example, if you take the deportation flights that have happened in the UK and the amount of pressure that was put on like British Airways and Virgin and whatnot for them to stop those deportations, the Home Office now has had to look for, charter flights in order to carry those out. So we can see that there is power in like the collective pressure of putting those companies out. So I guess that would be, from my perspective, one way of doing it. I don't know if the other speakers might have more insights, better insights.
Yeah, for me, it's a really difficult question, isn't it? And I guess it was a point that I was trying to tease out what I was thinking through earlier when I asked the question around the tech companies themselves. And I guess some of the thinking I've done with other people around the table is around, well, it's about data. There's data use in the manipulation of data, isn't there? And you're right, Laurie, you made reference to your mobile phone and type of data that's captured there and how that can be extracted by different groups and organizations. But then there's particular technologies that I see as particularly offensive. For example, I know of, and not putting this on the academic, but I know of technology which is now looking to determine people's emotions when they're being interviewed coming across borders. In essence, a lie detector test, or the extent to which the individual is being truthful or not. Now, I can't conceive of any way in which that tech can be presented as a positive feature. So there's something about explicitly, and whether that's academics or pressure groups, putting challenge on the team, the academic or the institution to say this tech is hugely problematic. Similarly, facial recognition. How else can we conceive of facial recognition as being positive? It can only be negative. So something about an outright challenge against that type of tech, but then recognizing that the usage of data in some ways has always been and always will be. And I guess there's something about how we begin to maybe build typologies or ways of thinking about where the points of resistance should be and at what lines should be drawn against certain forms of tech. Maybe that's not clear, but I'm just thinking around how complex this is and how we should be responding to it. But there is something about those tech companies. I know earlier we've just made reference to some of them, but there is something about tech companies also in the business of making money. And in essence, while we can sell it, we can develop this tech and then sell this tech as a solution to a crime problem in inverted commas. And maybe there's something about putting that pressure on those organizations within that regard as well. If they see this as a viable way of making money, then the pressure may be placed on them by saying, look, this is problematic, whether it's share values. Just an anecdote, I have some colleagues who are prison abolitionists. And I remember they took the bold decision, I guess it was over a number of months, to decide whether it was right to do it or not, but bought a pound share in companies like Serco and Sodexo, who were investing in prisons, so that they were able to therefore go into AGMs and go into meetings and challenge the existence of the prison and the harms that were taking place within those prison spaces. Now that feels symbolic, but there's something about those individuals being able to enter that AGM, those board meetings, and then level those challenges directly. Why are you encouraging the use of? Why are you building immigration detention centres, etc.? So there's something there as well that I think is quite interesting in terms of thinking around more innovative solutions or responses to some of this. But I guess lots of work to continue to do in some of that.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Anyone else like to answer that question? I'm going to put one more question to the panel. So if you have anything to in response to what Lara and Patrick have said, you can also put that maybe in the response to this final question before we close. So the last question that I'm going to select is one that's really interesting, and I think it will be really important on how we go forward and what we can do beyond these meetings. But as Richard highlighted, the police bill has been delayed again. So whilst we put pressure in this time, I think this question is really important to speak to that. But how do we resist without providing space for increased police power? For example, exposing the lack of trust and failures of the police without allowing the police to use this in order to increase community policing. So again, that is, how do we resist without providing space for increased police power? I see you nodding, Patrick. So would you like to get us started? Would you like to speak to that question?
I'm nodding because it's one of those really important questions that often raises itself. And you're right, it's literally something that me and some colleagues are thinking about. The fact that we argue about, and somebody said it earlier, over-policing and under-policing, and to highlight under-policing becomes the space within which the police will say, okay, what we need to do then is have more police as a way of increasing that, responding to that under-policing question. And there's a challenge there and there's a problem there as well. I guess for me, there's also questions around how we just divest ourselves from a reliance upon the police. in terms of under-policing, and that becomes an important question. And I'm not speaking here about defunding the police or abolition of the police, because I think there's a different conversation we need to have within the UK and across Europe, rather than simply picking up a concept from over the States. And I don't say that to be offensive in any way. I just think we need to think through how policing is imagined and delivered within the current context. But I think there's a challenge in terms of how we do this. But the reality is that the position I take, and being one of those criminologists that Kevin spoke about earlier, there's a reality that crime is not addressed and responded to by the police. It never has done and never will be. The criminal justice system, as imagined, doesn't respond to the problem of crime. In fact, and the reality is, and the police know this, they're not very good at policing crime and criminality. So on that basis, therefore, it's not my appeal to the police to be able to respond to the under-policing. It's about how communities identify alternative ways in which they can divest from a reliance upon the police. Now, that becomes quite difficult in the context of, for example, violence. So a lot of my work was around disrupting the gangs label and resisting the incursion of gangs units and ending gangs and youth violence strategies. But the reality as well is that there are violences which take place within particular communities. So how do we respond to that violence without an appeal to the police? And the reality is a vast majority of violence takes place which doesn't come to the attention of the police. Violence within the domestic sphere, violence meted out on children within the domestic home, etc. We already deal with violence or attempt to deal with violence in particular ways. My concern with the police, therefore, is that what they do is identify particular forms of violence that they're interested in, that they deem as important, rather than the violence that the vast majority of society experience. And I'm also talking here about structural violence as well as experienced. I guess my response to the question therefore explicitly is that the lack of trust and failings of the police is a feature of policing. They're not there to support communities or assist Black and brown communities. They're there to regulate Black and brown communities. So it's about divesting from those communities and finding serious community-based solutions to the problems that we experience and endure.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I think that was very well said. Is anyone else that would like to answer that question before we summarise and close? Yep, go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, just following on from what Patrick said, it's about how we reinvest in our communities. And again, as a sort of youth worker, and one of my sort of ex-young people who's now works at Bradford College, I'm going to embarrass him, Piers Telemack, absolutely amazing, inspiring young man, actually, who fought heavily against sort of disinvestment in youth services in Bradford, when the then council, before I was part of, were threatening to cut youth services by over 80%. And Piers led a campaign to say, well, actually, you do this, you're going to see all sorts of issues with policing and all sorts of other stuff. And he stopped that cut being so significant. So it is about investing in those public services around youth services. It is putting more money in to sort of community centres and community action projects. And actually that's because, as Patrick said, the police serve a purpose to sort of control and discriminate against sort of Black and brown communities. And the way we resist effectively, I've always found, is through those community organising methods, whether that's in schools, youth centres or community-based projects. That's been the most effective way I've certainly seen.
Thank you very much, Richard. Yep, go ahead, Kevin. Thank you.
2 quick points. I mean, this question started off on the basis of increasing police powers, which is obviously what the bill's doing. I mean, I think it's important that we don't argue for the status quo. So the fact that the bill increases this wide-ranging draconian new powers doesn't mean that you should argue, well, the police have got enough powers already. They already have too many powers. The demonstrations that you've seen being cracked down on by the police over the last couple of weeks aren't with the new powers of a new bill. They're with the existing powers that already exist. Certainly we argue all the time that the police we should have less powers, fewer laws, and that there's already too much criminal justice legislation been implemented over the last 20 years, and we need to stop this. One thing I wanted to just very quickly mention in relation to the issue around kind of at a local level and about trust. I'm sure many people have heard this mantra about policing by consent. And one of the things that happens at a local level is that the police will argue that they want to do X or Y, whatever it might be, put in a dispersal zone over an area, or put police officers into schools, or whatever it might be, that they do that on the back of, oh, we've got community support for this. And unfortunately, quite often what that means is that they've got buy-in from co-opted sections of the community that basically have a narrow, quite often very conservative view on issues around crime. One of the key things that we've argued about that kind of hands-on work that you need to do at a local level is maintaining that some degree of independence when you're doing this, and not thinking very carefully about avoiding the prospects of being co-opted by both the police but also the local state, and particularly thinking about whether the offer of funding therefore puts you in a position that you're no longer able to speak as effectively, or help people to speak effectively themselves about the issues which they're facing. The issue around the need for police monitoring groups that I constantly bang on about is that they need to be independent police monitoring groups, that there needs to be some care to avoid that sense of being co-opted, because that's what's always happened. There's always been attempts to try and neutralize the effectiveness of people who do local organizing by bringing them on board.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And I think that finally brings us to the closing and the points that I was going to make in the summary. So thank you. I think I was going to make a few points that really connected everything that we've really been speaking about today, because there's been so many different thing that's been covered by, you know, all the speakers. You've really shared your perspectives quite brilliantly and really given me a lot of things to think about. So I'm sure all the attendees as well are left with a lot of thoughts. So first up, I would like to start off on the impact of the report and the impact this report's had so far. And so far we've obviously managed to have conversations where we're talking like this and we're listening to what people are saying, and we're also connecting with some of the issues raised by the use of the device on a wider level. But it's also been quite effective in getting the police actually and the Crime Commissioner in West Yorkshire and the West Yorkshire Police to recognise a lot of the things that we've been saying since 2018. So we have been in conversations with the West Yorkshire Police as well as the Crime Commissioner, and have asked them to respond to the recommendations that we've set out in both of our reports, which is the hate crime report that Laura shared in the chat for people to look at. But if you can't see the chat, you can also go onto the Racial Justice website and view these reports, where we've asked the police to respond back to our recommendations, clearly stating how they're going to address some of the concerns that we have raised about hate crime, but also the use of the device and the technology. Also, I think speaking on the impact of the report, is also important to then talk about the implications, as what the implications are of the report, but also the technology. And I think this is where we need to then keep putting more pressure, as the implications, as the different speakers have shared, are quite vast. And some of those implications that have been shared is the continued surveillance and over surveillance of Black and brown bodies and marginalised bodies. And as Patrick so brilliantly said, if we're then using this technology to survey these communities, if the data that we're getting into this technology is already dodgy, this also means that the data that we're getting from it is therefore dodgy. The police argue that the use of these devices, the introduction of these new laws to protect the police, is to allow for effective policing. So it's more because it's more efficient, therefore it's more effective. But we argue that we already know that the police and a lot of the institutions that work very closely with them have institutional racism. So if these devices are going to make them more work efficient and more effective, we argue that it makes institutional racism more efficient and also more effective. So then this brings us to the data harms, as Patrick touched on, that are, you know, inflicted on Black and brown communities, ethnically minoritized communities, but also ethnic, not even immigrant and those seeking asylum and refugee communities. And then we move on to the protection of police powers that's been introduced by these bill and the implications of that. And, you know, I think one of the things that Richard mentioned that was really important and is important to talk about is the figure that you mentioned, Richard, of people who have made complaints regarding the police. So you mentioned, and I want to repeat this to really show how, you know, stark it is, out of the 5,000 complaints that were put, only 153 were upheld by the court. So again, that made it 97% rate, the 97% rate of complaints that were, you know, were disregarded and taken nowhere, which in the case of Shukri Abdi really calls us to questions. What does this then mean for other people who have, you know, experiences with the police that are very damaging on the very human level, and what that means for them for getting justice? So as we go into this era where we're arguing for more police powers, what does that mean to all of us, not only marginalized communities, but all of us? The data harms that happen to one community therefore affects all of us. You know, it starts with people who we might think, oh yeah, that doesn't impact us, but where does it end? Where is the slippery slope, and how this data is going to be used against all of us? So that then brings us to my penultimate point, what we can do. And there's been several different things that our speakers have touched on what we can do. And I would just like to repeat some of those as we leave this meeting. Is, you know, what we ask you to do is to further support our campaign, the Stop the Scandal campaign, as this is putting pressure on the police and the use of technology, but also on police powers when they are using this technology. We also ask that you keep an eye out for our second report that will be coming out on Stop the Scan, where we will be analysing some of the FOI figures that we got and analysing this data. So keep an eye out on this report and please share and circulate it. As Richard so gladly and so amazingly touched on before, is writing to your MPs. We all do have the power to do something, and we can let our MPs know and our elected officials that we are not happy and that we're not, you know, we see the potential outcomes coming from this new bill, but also from the use of the technology so far. But also about building relationships, this idea of thinking local but also acting global, and making different links, of course, different organizations or different individuals who are also interested in fighting against some of the injustices that we see at the hands of the police. So continue to build these relationships. We really like to thank every organization and any individual who's been involved in the campaign so far, but continue to get involved, continue to bring more people into the conversations. There was a lot of questions around how we disrupt the tech. Patrick so brilliantly put forward that question, or how we, you know, go forward and we campaign against the police without necessarily being drawn into this. And a way that we can do this is continue to build those relationships. We may not have the skills or the resources to disrupt certain tech companies from the onset, but connect with communities or people that may do. You may connect with people that know these, you know, these technology and these devices, and also these laws are being introduced even before they come to our community. So continue to build these relationships so we can be in spaces where we can disrupt from the onset. I'm also thinking about who's around the table and thinking about maybe the different strategies and how we sort of legislate or sort of do litigations against some of the police as well. So maybe by connecting with different organizations, we can continue to have these conversations that foster more ideas and how we go forward. I think finally, there was a really important point that was mentioned, is really how complex all of this and how sometimes it might seem like a lot of hard work. And that's completely understandable because there is a lot to do. And I'm a person that comes from an emotional place myself. I'm quite emotive and in tune with my emotion, and all of this can be quite tiring. However, the fact that it's complex should not deter us and should not stop us and continue doing what we need to do. And, you know, for example, Kevin mentioned about policing by consent. Patrick mentioned about diversing from the police. All of these things seem like sizable feat at these moments, but we need to continue to have these conversations so we can begin to look at what does community and policing look like? What does it look like when we diverse from, you know, relying on the police and actually invest into our communities and invest into our networks? So I would like to end there, and I would like to end my final point on thanking everyone so much for everything that you've done towards getting involved in the campaign. I would really like to thank, you know, the team on the campaign that worked on this report, that continue to work on having events like this where we continue to share and talk about some of the issues and injustices that we face. I would like to also thank the speakers. Thank you so much for sharing these perspectives, and we look forward to continue engaging with you and having these conversations with you in the future. And finally, thank you so much to the Racial Justice Network, our director Penny, our trustees, our team, our project officer and comms officer who have made all of this possible. And thank you finally to the audience for joining and being here today. If you have any questions or you'd like to follow up at anything that has been said by the speakers or myself during this event, please do get in contact with us. You can go on our website or on our social medias and get in contact with us and let us know.